Look, welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name's Soren Reichelt, and if you've been following our series with Secure Agility, the Cloud Insight series, each month we explore a different topic, primarily around where we have questions coming from customers about specific things within cloud computing, and mainly the changes that are happening through technology as well. So today's session in the Cloud Insight series is really addressing a burning question we get from a lot of customers around information security and cyber security, and looking at how they can make the best decisions or most informed decisions in where they invest or where they prioritize those investments as well. It's about a 30-minute session today, and we've got a great panel which I'll kick into. So the topic is Best Practice Security, ISO 27001 Uncovered. So what we'll look to do is explore a little bit about ISO 27001 and how that can be leveraged, but also look for how organizations can use these tool sets and explore a little bit with the team that we've got and the panel that we've got as well, the questions that come out through that process as well. So look, I probably should introduce our panel that we have here today. So I've introduced myself, Soren, but I've got Taminda and Sarah. Taminda from Polay Consulting and Sarah from Secure Agility. So thank you for making some time for us today, team, and also for collaborating on building out this presentation as well. I really appreciate it.
It's good to be here.
Awesome. All right, well, look, Taminda, I mean, we've got a title here, Security Quality Consultant for Polay Consulting, but I know that you also lead Polay Consulting.
I do.
Talk us through a little bit about, I guess, your primary role when you're engaging and working with organizations.
Yeah, it's a great question because it's quite varied. Security quality consultant needs to meet their client at the point of the journey that they're actually in. Mm-hmm. So that's very, very important to understand. But I think if I was to answer it as a general response, is that we are very much tasked to assess the point in time or the baseline in which the client is at in terms of their security journey, understand and facilitate and help them to coordinate their risk assessments, which drives the program and the pipeline of activity and response, and then help them govern or set up the governance model to implement the responses to the risks that they've identified, and then to get them ready for the various stages of audit, whether it's a self-audit, it's an external audit, and then, in a full cycle is how do you actually turn that into an ROI, which is a benefit realization or a unique selling proposition. So it's varied depending on where the person is or the company is, but that is a high-level response.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're sort of touching there on people, processes, and technology. So
yeah, very much so.
One part of project management, also education, I imagine, in a lot of that process as well. Yes. Which is awesome. Well, thank you again for taking the time. And Sarah, GM of Compliance and Operations, I know that you've just completed our ISO 27001 audit for this year. How did
certainly have, yes. Yeah, we went very well, thank you. Just finished yesterday. So very happy with where we're at. And, it was good that the auditor mentioned that sort of over the last 3 years, we've matured a lot. And he's come on that journey with us. So, yeah, it's been really good. And I'm done now for the year.
We're it for the year, and we can do it again next year. I guess the key point there, so your role's really, I guess, from a security aspect, our CISO, so looking after our different compliance requirements, but ultimately too making sure that we continuously improve. And I think we're going to touch on that a lot today about ISO 27001 not being a point in time process, and how businesses really leverage, I guess, and get value out of that as well. So, well, look, let's talk a little bit about, I guess, information security. Now, one of the things that I often talk to clients about is we get confused in the terms sometimes of cyber security, information security, and if you look at over the past, even if it was 5 years, maybe even 10 years, just the sheer amount of information that we share, that we communicate, that we now collect, even from things like social media platforms or marketing tools and these sorts of things. We're collecting massive amounts of information about our customers, but also potential markets and bits and pieces. Before we draw into that topic of, I guess, ISO and information security, Taminda, I want to sort of cover off some of these points that are in this slide. So why do you think organizations really struggle with information security, aside from the obvious of consistent change and growth of data?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with, and it's a really great question because it's definitely multi-pronged, unfortunately. It's not a one-stop shop answer, but I'll do my best in a few minutes without boring the whole audience. But I think very much if we limit it down to 5 years, bearing in mind that really the last 2 years has been a pandemic. So information security, particularly when it goes around to ISO, I would believe 5 years ago, it was very much relegated or understood as the information or the IT manager or the security manager or the service desk manager's responsibility. It was generally seen very much as a service desk, service performance type compliance. Whereas bring now to where we are post-pandemic, which has been the #1 lever for digital disruption. I'm sorry, digital disruption, but digital adoption, because now we're all being forced to work in a mobile situation. And the advancements in the GDPR from the European Union, the global push for privacy and security information, but also a national push from an Australian government perspective and a state level perspective around how we treat and manage data. So you have this unique bubble where the pandemic has pushed organizations to rapidly respond to remote working situations. And that is one pillar. Then a lot of organizations responded very well. They've put in a lot of those protections. So now they're looking at the next level of evolution or maturity. But in conjunction with that, they're now facing new Australian and national regulation, as well as the impact of GDPR, which is really a market-leading push for information security. So I think it's very multi-pronged, and particularly with government data, we've talked, some of our previous clients are in around how do you determine right fit for risk. So a lot of the policies come out with a really great intent, but they don't have the full instructions of how you're going to comply to that, because it's almost like bringing in new legislation. Until it's breached, we don't know what the precedents are or the actions are to actually show that you're conforming to it. So it's a very unique time to be in information security.
Absolutely. And so I guess, from Secure Agility's perspective, we've got very, heavy obligations around the things that we use information for and the data that we collect with customers. What are your sort of observations around where maybe ourselves or even our clients struggle with information security?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Taminda. Obviously, the changing landscape of what's happening across the globe at the moment. But I think it is quite a daunting prospect as well. You don't have some kind of framework in place, something that can guide you through it. It seems like a really big, daunting task when it first hits you. So I think most people struggle in kind of, where do we start? It's just the enormity of it. And how do we know which areas to cover, and how do we know we've covered that legislation or that control that we need to put in place? So yeah, it's a big task, and I think what most people struggle with.
Yeah, just understanding where to begin in that process. And I think, some of my observations are that, you may have varying roles, or we'd have different sized organizations, but just understanding who's responsible can be the first part, and then identifying where those risks sit. I mean, the key point here around information security isn't just the job of IT. I think that for a lot of businesses will okay, what does that mean? IT has traditionally been responsible for anything to do with information.
Absolutely.
And it's a good segue there, because I mean, who is responsible for information security in an organization then? I mean, in my experience, really working, I guess, with technology teams, their traditional reporting lines in organizations may go through a financial function. So you might see your chief financial officer being responsible for risk or quality, but then also technology. Taminda, in your experience, I guess, looking at the different scale size organizations, who is really responsible for information?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, in my yeah, absolutely. This is a very complex question because it is multi-layered. And you're absolutely right. Like 5 years ago, it would have been very clearly the IT manager. But since, you know, this, you know, explosion of digital platforms, it's now marketing, it's now sales, it's now all of this. But at the end of the day, what I like to see is that you need to draw back down to the legislation of the countries of which you capture that data. And that's where it comes through the Australian privacy principles and the GDPR as the major influences of accountability. But what most people don't understand right now, and I think very much, I think CEOs and board members understand the accountability and risks as being a corporate member, but it's essentially everyone's responsibility. Now, and that's what a lot of people don't realize. It's actually an uninsurable risk. So myself, potentially as a salesperson or just in my own role, working from home or working in a cafe or working on an airplane, and someone takes a photo of my laptop, that is a personal liability to me, and it's uninsurable. So this is what we're going to see more and more of in the next 5 years. And particularly if you're holding government data or you're holding incredibly sensitive information, that is a really massive consideration coming into how you approach your certification in ISO, or even you don't need to go the certification route, but the importance of having an ISO compliance, because it gives you those parameters, the audits, the, I guess the controls to support information security organization, and also make sure employees are aware that they're also personally liable. A lot of people don't know that. Everybody is liable to a certain extent.
Yeah. And it's obviously, I mean, you look at from a business level, I mean, I've seen some of the data breaches and the reputational damage that can happen through that. I mean, it's never fun to talk about those things, but they happen.
It's a reality.
You know, you look at things like accounting firms and the types of information that they store about individuals, and then the people that are around those pieces of information now working remote. You just think of the enormity of the problem. And I mean, we haven't spoken about what ISO is yet, but we'll get into that and how that's used to address those sorts of things. But it is interesting now, Sarah, for you, I mean, you are responsible for information security at a level in terms of our structure at Secure Agility. That's really a role and function that we're very fortunate to have, right? Some businesses don't necessarily have that level of resource to just focus on these things.
Yeah, definitely. Look, you know, it's good that I have that focus. Obviously, I do wear other hats within the business, and I think in most businesses, depending on the size of the business, you know, people are going to be wearing multiple hats.
Yeah.
But unless they're in a very big enterprise where, you know, they will have a dedicated teams for that. So it just depends on the size of the business, but you know, more and more it has to be a focus, and somebody needs to take ownership of that, to make sure that everybody is aware of their responsibility. You know, and we run awareness training quite regularly to protect them as well, obviously our staff, and protect our business from risk.
Yeah, from those risks as well. One of the observations that I make is, you know, in a lot of, I guess, the small to medium-sized businesses, if you asked, you know, who's responsible for information security, it might often be a partner, you know, where they've not necessarily had the resources to manage technology. So that's been sitting with a partner, and the world is changing. So the partner's still holding the responsibility stick, but not necessarily managing those things as well, which in itself is a risk, which I think is an interesting one to really talk about as we get through the process of ISO as well. So look, one of the things that I actually did, because often we see this, I guess, information security roll up through finance and into that risk quality area as well, is I went out to a group of chief financial officers. I think there's about 400,000 members on LinkedIn. And I just asked that question. I said, well, what is the most important cybersecurity topic for CFOs? And the interesting part there is that it's not surprising, but 71% said identifying our risk. Now, Taminda, what does that sort of point to from your?
It's actually very consistent. It was surprising actually for you because we had that debate, but it was very consistent in the ISO community, because one of the major struggle points that everyone has in an organization, whether you're big or small, is identifying the risks. And that is a crucial starting point to determine what do you need to implement, how much you need to invest into the risk treatment plan or the risk mitigation plan.
Yeah.
And what many organizations who have been doing this for years actually say that most organizations only have a risk register that identifies 30% of their known risks.
Mm.
Now, if you think about that right now, that means right now, each of you that are listening to this call, your organization you don't even know 70% of the potential risks that are hitting you.
Mm.
I think that's really scary. And what I love about this just to be reconfirms that, because we're going home at night, sleeping, going, what keeps me in bed what keeps me up at night? You know, it's all these unknown risks. And it's really important that what I don't want to scare people with is it's not scary to identify the risks. What's scary is to not identify the risks.
Yeah, to not know. Yeah, that's right.
To not know, because otherwise you're in that anxiety loop. So it actually only takes, you know, a few hours, a few days, depending on the size of your organization, to identify those risks and prioritize them. You don't necessarily have to act on them all. So with me, I actually thought this was quite consistent with that industry finding. And I don't want to scare people on the poll to not take action, because it's really a really simple fix.
Yeah, and that is interesting as well, because we look to ISO 27001 as a potential answer to identifying those risks, and we've mentioned this term a few times. We can't be too forward to say that everyone understands what ISO 27001 actually is. Tamina, do you want to just give us the 2-minute overview, I guess, or even less, of ISO 27001? What really is that?
I'll try and do it less, because I think the important thing that most people that I interact with, and my observation is that people think it's a checklist or it's an audit. It's actually a framework, and it's an ongoing life cycle. And I can see Sarah nodding, so that's great. So Sarah, jump in, because you're never done with ISO. It's a maturity model. So I think I was guilty of it too 5-10 years ago. It's like, oh, we did an ISO audit for a client and we ticked the box and then we forgot about it. But now you can't forget about it, but it doesn't need to be overwhelming, because what auditors acknowledge, and Sarah touched on that, you know, earlier in our panel, is that it's a journey, and you need to make these educated risk reward trade-off decisions as you would in any other business conversation, as to how far you invest to what you're going to get, and what is the reward and what is the mitigation. So it is a framework, it is a checklist, it's a series of controls, it's all of that, but it is an evolution model that can create massive value for your organization.
Yeah, and you look at these points here, I mean, to systematically examine information security risks and taking into account the threats, vulnerabilities, and impacts. I mean, just that key point there, using this framework to identify these things in a structured way, that might be the only parcel of value that someone gets from the process to begin with, but that continuous cycle of improvement, you're never going to be perfect from day one. And we'll talk a little bit about all the different areas that are covered a little bit later on, and how that prioritization works. But I guess looking at that, we spoke a little bit about, you know, ISO 27001 and that process. Do you want to just talk us through the process an organization goes through to get started with ISO?
Yeah, for sure. And Sarah, jump in. But initially, like ISO has evolved a lot over the decades, and essentially it has sections 1 to 4 are around your context and how to apply it. But it really focuses on a 4-stage iterative cycle of plan, do, check, and act. And as the word suggests, you know, planning is probably the most important bit, in my opinion, because it's really where you assess the risk in your organization, you apply a consistent approach across all your teams to measure that, and you determine the risk profile for every one of those risks. Because, you know, number one question, I'm sure we're going to get into it, Soren, is how much money should I spend on this, right? Yeah. Prioritized question. We only have as much money as we have. You know, you can mitigate till the cows come home, but sometimes the penalty is actually less than the mitigation.
Yeah, you need to weigh up
Let's
the
be
cost
realistic.
against, yeah.
You could risk yourself out of business if you want to.
Risk yourself out of business, and that's not okay either. This is not and what I like about this process is that it takes that into consideration. The due position is exactly what it is, and this is what we're talking about. Is it's really important to treat this as a project and have the governance structure around it. Now, this doesn't have to be a full-time 10, 20 person project team like Sarah knows. It could be one person, but it's important to think about the right levels of project governance and control to support that one person to drive it in your organization. And the checking is more important than ever. As I said, this is not a shelfware conversation. This is a continuous evolution, and it will become a unique selling proposition for your clients, for your employees, as we talked about, protecting them and their risk, but also about how you evolve in your maturity. And then the ACT is exactly what ACT suggests. It's okay, we've identified this, and this is how we're going to improve it, and we're going to act upon that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the examples I use here is often we're not limited for choice when it comes to different security solutions as technologists, to be honest. There are the number of terms that you're dealing with at any given point. I think a lot of customers are really in that ACT state, but maybe buying the features rather than the actual need. Does that make sense? And certainly around, and I'm really focusing wholly on the technology element there. Is okay, buy first and that'll just solve our problem. But are you buying the right solution? Is this actually identifying and solving the prioritized risks? And some of those things might not be technology.
Yes, the governance around it is very important. So don't just throw technology at it. Like you know, you need to have the governance process there to actually decide what you need, what your requirements are, rather than just running out and spending a lot of money on technology that actually might not fill those gaps.
It might solve the biggest risk. I mean, this is why I've enjoyed, I guess, this conversation at a process level, because when you're designing solutions with customers, often it's, well, what are your requirements? And well, we don't know, we just want to be safe. But in this instance, what we're saying is by adopting the ISO process, customers will be able to identify those risks, prioritize them effectively, and then go through this cycle of continuous improvement. You can't go from level 1 to level 10 in one leap, but at least moving forward through that process to continuously solve them. And then in 5 years' time, or Sarah, as you were saying, in 3 years' time, we've increased our maturity exponentially by using this process.
Yeah, and I'd extend on that saying, you cannot reinforce the importance of that risk assessment, because then it's the actual requirements of the business driving the technology purchasing. So often we come in to halfway through a journey and we have to create the ROI for the technology that was purchased 2 years ago. It still would have been, it's still going to be potentially a good fit, then it's fine. But from a, on a true general, I guess a financial perspective of a business, they may have been able to delay the purchase of that software for 2 years, which over a 1,000-seat licensed business is a lot of money. So it's more about getting the technology sequence on the right roadmap, and in line with the risk mitigation. Yeah,
and that's, I guess, a good point to cover off there, because we look at, what does ISO 27001 actually cover? We're talking very specifically about maybe some technologies like endpoint protection or firewalls or bits and pieces, but it's so much broader than that. I don't want to go through every one of these because we have time. But when we talk about prioritizing, that's what we're really saying here, isn't it, Tamindu and Sarah? There's so many different areas that this covers. Like I'm looking at asset management, physical and environmental security. ISO 27001 is a lot broader than just our server room and how we prevent bad actors from attacking, if that makes sense.
Completely. And to extend on that, it's ISO, when we talked about that framework, I think 3 slides back, it's not just the IT manager's responsibility more. And ISO breaks it down into, was it HR, IT, and business, Sarah? And you'll see a lot of this, like you see point 3, human resource security. That can just be a policy, or it could be a check-in to your organization or a sign-in. It doesn't need to be a technology solution. And that's where the ISO framework is more than IT now. It is business process people. And the Annex A that you see here listed out actually outlines each control and how you can determine to apply each control in your organization based on your risk assessment. But one of the things I do want to call out here that has advanced, because it was one of the criticisms of ISO 27001, was that it didn't give explicit examples of how to implement the control. What they've done now is in ISO 27002 is given a lot more practical examples as to how you can apply different controls. So it's really important to consider that there are other controls within the frameworks, not just 27001, that can help you in your journey.
Yeah, yeah. And for a business, like you said, it's one thing to have a policy and a document that sits there and says, okay, comply to the policy, but making sure that the procedures are in place to actually enact that and have people perform and control to that and be able to manage and monitor that is just as important. So tackling all of this in one go can be quite difficult when you look at all the different areas of the business it might touch. And certainly in different industries, right? When you look at environmental security, physical security in different industries can be very different, depending on the nature of your business and what's happening there as well. So I mean, it is a big journey. We've spoken about this being, I guess, a continuous cycle of that. One of the things that's important is you need to be able to generate value other than just mitigating risk. Sarah, from our perspective at Secure Agility, I mean, we're a technology business, we're a consulting business. We work with a range of government clients, many different industry segments that we work in. I mean, how do we really gain value from ISO 27001? How does the leadership team measure that from our perspective?
So many different ways, Soren, but just down to sheer things like the process side of things. We've got a proper framework in place. Like you say, we've identified our risks. We're able to mitigate those and monitor our performance on an ongoing basis. And there's that continual improvement there that we are monitoring, obviously quarterly, because it's a quarterly management reviews that we do. But that also has opened a lot of doors for us in terms of business opportunity as well.
Yeah.
So it opens up the demographic of who we can work with, particularly, like you say, in the government space. It's becoming a lot more of a requirement now, not just from government, but from other customers as well. So particularly when you're going out to talk to customers and you're putting a proposal in front of them, at the same time, they're asking you to fill in a security questionnaire. And, as soon as you say, well, I'm ISO 27001, that kind of cuts down some of that work that you need to put into that as well.
Yeah.
Because they know, what you're going through and the amount of work that actually goes into achieving that and maintaining it. So,
and businesses have seen this before with quality systems, right? You need to have this quality system in place in order for us to transact and do business with you.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting point, and I concur with what you said there, Sarah, which is it's a big part of my conversation when working with customers is baselining, because when we are doing a managed service or bits and pieces with the client as well, we do need to make sure that we're managing information in a solid way. And businesses are now starting to look to that as a standard for us to even get through the first round. In terms of
when you say also, sorry, and that to Sarah's point, I just wanted to clarify for people that I used to think it was just government, like you're talking about government requirements, but a lot of private entities don't realize that they're holding government data. And so don't just think your client, your prospective client or pipeline is government explicitly, because you might be able to add a lot of value to them because they are actually holding client government data. And so that's actually very much changed the way that we also qualify our pipeline, because we clarify now, are you, well, one, you're not government, but are you holding government data? And having the ISO certification makes a massive difference. It's a ticket to play.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got an example, Taminda, as well, where
Yes.
we're working with an organisation that acts on behalf of the government. So they're an entity outside of the government that hold employment information for many different people with many different disabilities and challenges that they're faced with. That organisation has no choice. The government has said you need to be ISO 27001 compliant in order for your business model to persist. So in that instance, what value are they gaining from your perspective? The ability to transact?
Well, the ability to transact, but also the penalty, penalty of aversion. What's the right word? Avoidance. And also what the government did, which great government, but did it with very little communication. So as you're right, Soren, a lot of the clients that we're working with now have found themselves thrust into a new ISO compliance space because of this government requirement. And if they don't do it very shortly, they will get penalties, or they may lose their ticket to play.
Yeah, we're seeing that in many different industries. I mean, we're all sort of anxiously waiting to see critical infrastructure, which covers so many different areas. We had some examples recently with major hazards facilities, and WorkSafe compliance and bits and pieces. So you've got different government agencies now acting in a cyber security and information security arena that traditionally haven't had that as a mandate. So I think, maybe some government entities are still getting the right balance. Right fit for risk, I think, is the example.
And the Essential 8 cybersecurity principles, absolutely. Yeah. If you're on the call and you haven't Googled those yet, it's really important that you take that away from this, because you're absolutely right, Soren. There's still a balance to be played, and the answer hasn't landed yet for each industry.
In different industries. So look, one of the things we wanted to cover off, and we're coming up to time, if not a little bit over here. Yeah, a little bit over. It's a big topic to cover in one hit. So we certainly invite everyone to connect with us post if there's some questions that you have around ISO 27001 or some things that maybe, you'd like to explore a little bit further. One of the things that we have been doing, though, is helping customers to baseline their business today to ISO 27001. So you don't need to go on the full journey towards accreditation, but just using, I guess, this framework as a part of a short, sharp engagement with your organisation to say, where are we? What does it look like? And start to prioritise some of those efforts. So we'll share this at the end of the session. And Taminda, I think you're also going to share out a bit of a quick risk assessment tool as well that businesses can use to get through. But we really encourage those organisations that are faced with that question of, how much should I invest? Where should I focus? What tools do I need? This is a really good way to build a framework behind that and then manage your partners and your staff in a part of that project towards that outcome that the business is looking to achieve. So look, thank you so much, guys, for joining that. 30 minutes absolutely flies past, but appreciate you guys taking some time and also preparing the presentation as well. Have a great Christmas. I think it's a welcome break for everyone as well, and well done, Sarah, on our ISO 27001 audit this year. Congratulations.
Soren, no, it's a pleasure. It's a passion of mine. So not many people say that, but it is.
I know. We're going to bring sexy back to ISO.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. The big process. Important to cover off as well. This is the last webinar for 2021 in our Cloud Insight series, but we will be coming back on the 2nd of February. We're looking specifically here at an executive briefing for cyber threats around the changes for critical infrastructure and major hazards facilities. So driven by some of our engagements across petroleum industry as well. So looking at that, I think that's with Fortinet as well. So you'll see the invitation come out. But thank you everyone for joining today. Hopefully there was some value in that. We'll certainly share the recording and the brochureware post. Thanks, team.
Thank you.
Bye. Merry Christmas.
Bye. Merry
Yeah.
Christmas.